This is an exhibit called Changing America. It commemorates and examines the history of the Emancipation Proclamation and the March on Washington.
Okay, let's start 100 years ago, 150 years ago.
Yes.
With the Emancipation Proclamation. As you understand it, what was the purpose of the proclamation itself?
In the most simple ways, the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in those Confederate states still in rebellion during the Civil War. That was its sort of legal constraint. It also did another important thing, which is it opened up Union Army, the Federal Army, to African Americans to participate in their own freedom. Those were the two key aspects of the Emancipation Proclamation. Most importantly, however, and everyone knew at the time, that while the law had limits, clearly its meaning was much larger than that. That if the Union won the war, that would be the end of slavery in America. This was known both within the North and in the South, and most importantly within the African American community, both free and enslaved.
Many people, when they hear about the Emancipation Proclamation, think it happened one day, President Lincoln signed it, and the next day everybody was free. Did it work like that?
Not at all. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation really is the result of hundreds of years of resistance within the African American community and within their white supporters to end slavery. And even as the Civil War began, the question about emancipation was still an unknown. And there are two sort of forces that come together and of equal importance, and we deal with this within this exhibit and make this point really clear, is that it really is the result not only of Abraham Lincoln enacting this presidential order, it also is the result of hundreds of thousands of African Americans enslaved, abandoning the plantations, the cities, crossing into Union lines, and really striking a blow for their own freedom. And it's the combination of both the political force of Abraham Lincoln and the abolitionists that have been working for generations, as well as the African American community forcing the issue upon the nation.
You talk about the political force. How much politics was involved in getting this finally signed and finally turned into law?
Well, it was a difficult political issue. I mean, Lincoln was facing political pressure from all different sides. The generals in the field were enacting their own policies, and Lincoln at times was trying to catch up with them. The abolitionist movement in the North was clearly impatient with Lincoln and putting political pressure on him. But equally important were these African Americans leaving the plantations, crossing into Union lines, and they were coming by the hundreds and thousands. It starts out first as a trickle, a few people showing up at Fort Monroe, and then going forward from there, in which literally there are refugee cities surrounding the Union troops. They, established very, makeshift housing. There's tent cities behind these Union lines. Once this sort of movement of humanity is forcing political pressure, everybody realized something had to be done. You're not going to return all of these people back to the plantation. The war to end the rebellion really became a war over slavery very early on. And the Emancipation Proclamation in some ways is part of a major step, a culmination of this. And ultimately then there's the 13th Amendment, which then ends slavery in the United States.
I understand that President Lincoln thought about an emancipation before 1863, but just didn't do it because of politics. Is that the way it went?
Well, Lincoln has these issues of how do you keep the Union together? And, people sometimes forget that within the Northern Union states were 4 slave states. And most importantly was Kentucky. And Lincoln felt that if you lost Kentucky, you would, in a sense, lose the war.
What were the 4 slave states?
You'll test me on this, it is Maryland, West Virginia, Missouri, and Kentucky.
Let's move ahead to 1963, 100 years later, and the March on Washington.
Yes, and it's no surprise that the March on Washington is scheduled 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a demonstration that clearly made this tie between the Emancipation Proclamation and the unfinished promise that was given. Martin Luther King in his speech talks about coming to cash a check. It's this promise of freedom that was unresolved. And I think an important aspect of this story that people don't often remember is that following the Emancipation Proclamation, within many African American communities, was the celebration of the Emancipation Day. That ongoing pressure, it was part of the culture within the African American community to remember and celebrate not only the emancipation, but the unfinished and unrealized promise. The March on Washington is very much the culmination of those early demonstrations and celebrations for emancipation.
But it took 100 years.
Which took 100 years, and many would argue many years more. I was 12 years old when the march was taking place, but I remember as a young kid its impact on my family and the larger community. And that's one of the important things about the march, is that it's incredible that 250,000 people descended on Washington from all parts of the country. The other thing is that millions of Americans across the country watched this demonstration, listened to the speeches, and it changed the way people thought about the civil rights movement and really helps propel the legislation that follows. Seeing this large group of people petitioning with their feet, coming to Washington, was an incredible thing to witness for everyone, and really changes the nation. It changes the dialogue about civil rights, much more than just an issue that they watched on TV in Mississippi and Alabama. It becomes a national issue. And that impact, I think, is one of its great legacies.
One of the things we want to emphasize in the stories we're doing is that there were a lot of people involved who sort of got overshadowed by Dr. King. A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman Porters, Bayard Rustin, Core, SNCC. Do you think history has sort of forgotten them?
Well, one of the important aspects of the March on Washington was this was a national coalition. And that's why its statement was so powerful. It's made up of all of the major civil rights organizations coming together that day. Often, in the past, they had operated in competition with one another for resources, for attention. Everything was put aside that day. And it was largely because of A. Philip Randolph, who's one of these figures that's often forgotten in American history, but he was really, in 1963, the elder statesman of the civil rights movement. All of these leaders, whether it was Martin Luther King or Roy Wilkins, all of the student radicals like John Lewis of the day, recognized him as such a leader that they really listened to his guidance. And that's what part made the march come together. The other aspect clearly is Bayard Rustin, who was another sort of forgotten figure, but was clearly the best organizer within the civil rights movement. And everybody recognized this. And so he was given this impossible task to put together the largest demonstration ever seen in American history in basically about 7 weeks. They make this announcement, while they've been talking about the march, they make this announcement in July that they're going to call together the nation to come to Washington on August. So while they had been planning the march for a while, the announcement was very short, and thousands of people respond. And in part, the reason that they were successful was the deep-seated organizations within the civil rights community, so that they could call upon, the black churches around the country, and they contributed. They could call upon civil rights leaders and organizations in small communities to organize buses to come up north. They also work within the labor movement, religious movement across the country, all of those coalitions make the day happen. And so while clearly Martin Luther King gives a speech that inspires generations, you also have this larger group of people, also giving incredibly powerful speeches, often not as recorded and played back, to viewers today, but clearly were powerful statements of their beliefs.
Is it the responsibility of historians, curators like you, to make sure all those stories get told?
Absolutely. I mean, we're hoping that people look at these two events and come away with a few important messages. One is that these are two pivotal events that change America. But probably even more important than any of the details of these events is this idea, this important lesson that social change happens through the work of not only gifted, inspired leaders, but thousands of ordinary people putting aside their day-to-day lives to help change America.
When somebody comes here to visit, what do you want them to take away from this exhibit? What do you want them to feel when they go home?
I hope, as I do when I go through this exhibit and look at these wonderful artifacts, that they're inspired. They're inspired by people who have made change in the world they live in, inspired that they too can participate in this larger changing, that not to be too cynical about life and society, and look from the past to draw lessons on how they might want to recraft the society they live in today.